So by now, we've learned that we can use JSX to render basically any HTML element that we want: divs, headers, image tags, etc. But one of the advantages of JSX is that we can render components within other components. So in our current app, there's not really a need to necessarily break it up into smaller components because I think the app component is actually pretty readable and lightweight by itself. But just for the sake of example, let's say we wanted to extract this line, line number 8 right here, the image tag representing this rotating logo. Let's say we wanted to separate that into its own separate component. So let's begin with that. As we know, a React component is just a function that returns JSX, so we could write either an arrow function or a traditional function with the function keyword. What I'm going to do above is declare it with an arrow function. So here I'll do a const called logo, and I'll declare it as an empty function, or a function that accepts no parameters. And in here, I'll provide my curly braces, and I will return some JSX, and I'm just going to copy and paste what I have on line 12 here. And now we have a new logo component. We have a component that simply renders the same image tag with the same logo. So now I want to utilize this logo component in my app component. So how do I do that? Well, first, let's remove our former code. And now, if I save, we'll see that the logo on the right-hand side goes away, so we know everything's working. The way that we render a React component is with the exact same syntax as we use with HTML elements. So we're simply going to put the opening tag, the less than sign, right? Then we're going to write the name of the component. In this case, it's going to be logo. And then we're going to put the closing sign, which is going to be the greater than symbol. All right, let me just delete this extra code that VS Code generated. Now, by itself, this is not going to be enough, because if we simply want to write it like this, there's an additional symbol that we're going to need to add, and that is going to be a /. And I'm going to add it after a space here and just place it before the greater than sign. So as you may be familiar with in HTML, there are both self-closing elements as well as elements that have both an opening and closing tag. So opening and closing tag elements are everywhere. In fact, they're everything we have here, right? So for example, for our header, we have our opening header tag and a complementary closing header tag. The same idea exists for our anchor tag right here. The same thing exists for our opening paragraph tag and our closing paragraph tag. But as you might be aware, there are other elements in HTML where you do not need both an opening and closing tag. You can simply have at least one tag as long as it is self-closing. The most common example of this is the input element. If you write input, you don't need a closing input element. You simply close it like so. You write the name of the element input, then a space, the /, and then the symbol, right? This is the exact same kind of visual look that the React team is going for. So logo is a self-closing component, which simply means it's going to render on the screen once and have all the content from this logo function right here. So you can think of this syntax as basically telling React to render the logo component, to run the logo function, take its returned JSX and substitute it right here where logo is. It's literally like a copy and paste of this code right here in this position. So when I save the file right here, we'll notice that the logo is back where it used to be, right? So we haven't really changed anything. We've just transferred some of the JSX to its own separate components. Now, here's where we're going to start to see the magic of some of these components. They are reusable, which means we can render them over and over and over again. So how easy is it for us to replicate the logo, let's say twice on the right-hand side? It's as simple as copying this line right here and simply pasting it below. Because each time we use that syntax, we're telling React that we want one more logo component rendered right here in this position. So it's once again going to run this function, once again going to get an image, and when I save this, we're going to see the logo appears twice. And of course, the benefit of this is we can isolate the logic and the syntax for this image right here, the specific source, the classes that we're attaching, the alt tag. We don't have to worry about all of that because it's been isolated to this component, and we can simply render that component as often as we'd like within other components, right? So I'm going to go ahead and remove this second logo right here and save it again. So we should see the right-hand side return to one logo, and it does. And I do want to quickly mention that there are two syntactical options for rendering components. One is with a self-closing tag like we have here, and one is with both an opening and closing tag. That would look something like this. So I'm simply going to write out logo. I'm going to avoid the slash and put just the closing sign, which is the greater than symbol. You'll see my editor will automatically generate the closing tag, but I'm going to delete it and write it out from scratch. But it's going to operate the exact same way as it does in HTML, right? So if you look, for example, at header, we have header right here. Then in the closing header tag, we put a /, then the element name. It's the same idea here. I'm going to write a opening tag, a slash, and then logo, and then close it off. And that indicates that I've closed off this component right here. And just like in HTML, we can put content in between the opening and closing component tag, like so. Just like we do in paragraph, right? We can put it between here. Now, in this case, it's not actually going to make a difference, but there are certain situations in React where the content you put between the opening and closing component tag will affect what you see on screen. The key takeaway here is if you're not putting any kind of content in between the opening and closing tags, and I know we haven't talked about when you would want to do that, but we will a little bit later. The point for now is if you don't have any content inside those tags, then stick with the self-closing tag because it's lighter, it's leaner, and it takes up less space, right? So we have no real reason right now to place anything in here. We don't even know the use case for this. And since logo by itself is just a plain image, this syntax is much terser and sweeter than this one, all right? I just want to show you that if I save this, it's going to work, and we're going to see that it offers an alternative syntax for rendering the exact same component. But typically, when we don't have any customization in between the opening and closing tag, we're just going to stick with a self-closing component. And once again, we will talk about what the content in between means a little bit later in the course. All right, so once again, let's return back to one single logo. And just to practice, the next thing we can do is to extract the paragraph and the hyperlink to their own components. And if you want to pause the video and try to do that yourself, you're more than welcome to. But let's go ahead and tackle it together right now. So what I'm going to do is call this chunk right here a component called text. So right here, I'm going to do const text. And it's going to be an arrow function. And I'm going to provide my syntax right here. We can actually use curly braces just like above and use the return keyword to return JSX. We can also utilize JavaScript's automatic implicit return. Typically, you do it whenever you have content on just one single line. So for example, if I did this, text would be an arrow function that always returns the value 1. But it turns out we can combine implicit JavaScript returns with the parentheses syntax that we saw earlier in the course. And that allows us to both have an implicit JSX return and also break up the content across multiple lines. So right here, I can simply copy and paste this paragraph right here. And this will still be considered technically a one-line implicit return. The point is this syntax is totally valid. We now have a text component that returns a paragraph tag. We've broken it up across multiple lines, but we've allowed it to be implicitly returned because we have the opening and closing parentheses. It will not work without the parentheses, so be careful. So now that we have that component, I can simply replace this content right here with a self-closing text component render. So text / the greater than sign, save that. And now you can see nothing changes on the right-hand side. Once again, the benefits of components is reusability. So if I wanted to repeat this text 3 times, I can simply copy and paste it 3 times, render that same component, and now we have 3 paragraphs with the same content being rendered on the right-hand side. Okay, so right here, I'm just going to remove the extra components. We don't need them. And finally, we're going to make our third component. And just to vary things up, let's use the function keyword syntax. There's no reason to do so besides just variety, but let's use the function keyword here, and I will call this component link. So once again, a function that accepts no parameters for now. It's going to return JSX, and I'm going to provide my opening and closing parentheses because this will be content across multiple lines. I'm going to copy and paste this hyperlink, paste it here. Obviously, the formatting is not great. Later on in the course, by the way, we will talk about how we can automatically format the code so we don't have to worry about all this indentation. It just looks good when we save the file. We'll talk more about that later. But for now, this will suffice. So I'm going to now render my link component in the body of my app component. So once again, we open up the component tag, just like an HTML element. We write the component name, which is going to be in uppercase. then since it's going to be a self-closing tag, let's do a space and then the slash and the closing bracket, the greater than sign. Save that. Once again, nothing changes on the right, but that's what we expect. We're rendering that Learn React link. Once again, if I copy and paste this down below, you can see it appear 3 times right here, and that suggests that everything we've done is correct. All right, so with that, I'm going to remove our extra links, and you can see that the app component now is smaller and in some ways a little bit easier to read. We now understand that it consists of a header element that contains a logo, some text, and a link. So our components don't just enable reusability, they also enable organization. They can have a structure like this where we understand the context or what something represents from a business logic perspective in our app, right? So as I mentioned at the very beginning of the lesson, there's not necessarily a need to break down app into smaller components, but it can be elegant either way, right? It's kind of up to us to determine what a component should be and how small and how large it should be and what its responsibility should be. Because it can render 1,000 lines of JSX if you want, or it can render 1, as we have, for example, right here. It's really up to us to find the right balance in describing the pieces, the chunks, the sections of our user interface, especially those that are reusable, and breaking them up so that we can put them back together again. All right, so that's the key takeaway from this lesson. Components can compose other components. They can hold other components that will in turn render their own JSX. The way we write that in line is with this syntax. You can think of this syntax as the equivalent of invoking that function, getting back the return value of the JSX, and simply placing it right here in line. So we're telling React, hey, find a logo component, invoke this function, give me this return JSX, and just replace it right here. And place it right here as many times as we write logo. That's as many times as React will invoke that logo component function to generate the JSX. All right, that's all there's to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.